A dark woman turned away from a private jet terminal. Minutes later, the entire staff is fired. Yvette walked into what should have been a routine flight, a world of polished floors and elite service, but instead, she faced a wall of assumptions and bias. What unfolded next wasn't just a confrontation. It was a moment that demanded accountability and justice. This is the story of how one woman refused to back down and turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful catalyst for change. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The rhythmic hum of engines filled the air as Yvette stepped out of the sleek black car that had ferried her to the exclusive private jet terminal. Her heels clicked softly against the polished pavement as she adjusted her tailored blazer, an elegant yet understated piece in a soft dove gray. She took a moment to gaze around the scene, a symphony of luxury, a parade of exotic cars, uniformed attendants, and pristine jets glistening under the late morning sun. Yvette inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air sharpen her focus. This trip was a pivotal moment in her life, tied to the global expansion of a project close to her heart. Over the past decade, she had built a reputation as a visionary leader in philanthropy, channeling her success into creating opportunities for marginalized communities. The world knew her as a woman of resilience, intelligence, and unshakable integrity. But beneath her calm demeanor, Yvette carried the quiet weight of her journey. She hadn't been born into this world of privilege. Every step she took in spaces like this was a testament to the struggles she had faced and the barriers she had broken. The whispers of doubt she sometimes heard in these circles didn't surprise her. They reminded her of how far she had come and why she couldn't stop now. Dressed in her carefully chosen outfit, a crisp white shirt paired with tailored trousers that exuded sophistication, Yvette turned heads as she walked into the terminal. Her natural curls framed a face that carried a quiet confidence, a look she had perfected over years of navigating unwelcoming environments with grace. She walked with purpose, her strides steady and deliberate, drawing glances from passengers who wondered who she was and what her story might be. The terminal was designed to impress. Glass walls stretched up to vaulted ceilings, flooding the space with natural light. Plush seating areas, marble floors, and modern art pieces created an ambience of exclusivity. It was a world where every detail was meticulously curated to reflect the opulence of its clientele. Yvette had been here before, many times in fact, but each visit reminded her that this was a world she had earned her way into, not one that had welcomed her easily. As she approached the reception desk, Yvette allowed herself a moment of reflection. The flight ahead wasn't just another journey. It was a step towards solidifying her mission. This business trip would finalize the international expansion of her foundation, which had already transformed the lives of thousands through education, healthcare, and housing initiatives. For Yvette, this was more than work. It was her legacy. The receptionist glanced up as Yvette approached, and for a moment, their eyes met. Yvette's warm smile was met with a polite nod as the receptionist returned to their task. She appreciated the professionalism, but couldn't shake the feeling of being quietly observed by others in the lounge. It was something she had grown accustomed to in places like this, a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment that she often ignored. Yvette found a seat near the expansive glass wall overlooking the runway. She placed her leather travel bag neatly by her side and opened her tablet to review her itinerary. Her fingers swiped across the screen as she mentally prepared for the meeting waiting for her at the other end of this flight. A soft announcement played in the background, and Yvette took a sip of water from the complimentary bottle an attendant had placed at her table. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to soak in the atmosphere. The hum of engines, the quiet chatter of passengers, the distant clink of glassware from the terminal cafe. This was her life now. It hadn't come easily, and she knew it would never stop challenging her. But Yvette was ready for whatever lay ahead. Yvette's focus on her tablet was broken by the subtle, yet familiar sensation of being watched. It wasn't unusual in settings like this, where exclusivity often bred silent scrutiny. She didn't lift her gaze immediately, choosing instead to take another sip of water and let the feeling linger. But the murmurs grew louder, small snippets of conversation floating her way. Do you think she's in the right place? She doesn't exactly scream private jet owner, does she? Yvette placed her tablet down, her fingers resting on its edge as she exhaled slowly. Her years of experience in navigating moments like these had taught her to pick her battles. Sometimes, a direct approach only served to escalate unnecessary tension. But today, she sensed that she might not have the luxury of staying quiet. Standing up, Yvette straightened her blazer, her movements deliberate and calm. She crossed the room toward the reception desk with a steady grace that belied the growing tension in her chest. Each step seemed to amplify the whispers behind her, but she didn't let it show. She had faced far worse than judgmental stares. At the desk, a woman in her mid-30s stood typing on a sleek monitor. Her blonde hair was pinned into a tight bun, her uniform impeccable, exuding the professionalism expected in such a setting. But her expression was less welcoming. Yvette recognized it immediately, an almost imperceptible tightening of the lips, the way her eyes scanned without fully seeing. The woman's name tag read, Brenda. Yvette offered a polite smile as she placed her documents on the counter. Good morning, she said, her voice steady and warm. I'm here for my flight on Jet 7. The departure is scheduled for noon. Here's my reservation and ID. Brenda didn't return the smile. Instead, she gave a cursory glance at the documents without picking them up, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. Jet 7, she repeated, as though the number itself carried a weight of disbelief. Yes, Yvette confirmed. It's under Yvette Blake. Brenda's lips twitched, not quite forming a full smirk, but enough to convey doubt. She finally picked up the reservation, her manicured nails clicking against the counter as she scanned it. She murmured, her tone neither warm nor particularly professional. Her eyes darted back to Yvette, giving her a once-over that lingered just a moment too long. Yvette stood her ground, her posture calm but alert. Is there an issue? She asked, her voice neutral but firm. Brenda's fingers tapped lightly on the counter. It's just, we don't often see walk-ins like this. Walk-ins? Yvette repeated, raising an eyebrow. I made this reservation well in advance. Everything should be in order. Brenda let out a soft chuckle, the kind that wasn't meant to be heard, but wasn't entirely accidental either. Of course. I'll check. She turned back to her computer, her movements deliberate, almost slow. Yvette couldn't help but notice the way Brenda's fingers hovered over the keys, as though prolonging the process intentionally. A minute passed, then two. Yvette's patience, though strong, began to wear thin. She glanced around the room, noticing how other passengers seemed to be watching the interaction with thinly veiled interest. She met their gazes briefly before returning her attention to Brenda. Finally, Brenda turned back, her expression carefully neutral, but with a hint of something Yvette couldn't quite place. Condescension, perhaps? I'm sorry, Miss Blake, she said, her tone clipped. I don't see your reservation in our system. Yvette felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. She took a calming breath. That's odd, she replied. I confirmed it with my assistant just yesterday. Could you check again, please? Brenda hesitated, then sighed. It was a subtle but unmistakable gesture of annoyance. She tapped a few more keys, her brow furrowing in an exaggerated effort. No, she said finally, shaking her head. There's nothing under that name. Are you sure you're in the right place? Yvette's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Yes, she said, her voice carrying an edge of steel beneath its calm surface. This is the private jet terminal, correct? Jet 7 is scheduled to depart from here. I'm exactly where I need to be. Brenda's smile didn't reach her eyes. This terminal is reserved for exclusive clientele, she said, the words dripping with an implication she didn't bother to hide. Perhaps you should check the main airport down the road. Yvette felt the full weight of Brenda's gaze now, a mixture of disbelief and condescension that she had seen far too often in her life. She stood taller, her confidence unshaken. I'd like to speak with the manager, she said evenly. Brenda's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. That won't be necessary, she replied, her tone edging on patronizing. There's clearly been a mistake, but I'm afraid I can't help you unless you have proof of your reservation. Yvette opened her bag, retrieving a printed confirmation and laying it on the counter. Here's everything you need, she said, her voice calm but firm. Now, I suggest you check again. Brenda's expression stiffened, but before she could respond, Yvette heard the low murmurs in the lounge grow louder. A few heads turned, and Yvette felt the weight of their stares once more. She knew this was no ordinary inconvenience. Something deeper was at play, and she was prepared to face it head-on. Yvette's calm demeanor masked a growing sense of unease. She had expected professionalism, perhaps even a hint of aloofness. It wasn't uncommon in such exclusive spaces. But the subtle hostility she was encountering wasn't something she could ignore. Brenda's refusal to acknowledge her reservation wasn't just procedural, it felt deliberate. As Yvette placed the printed confirmation on the counter, her hands steady and deliberate, she watched Brenda's reaction closely. The woman's eyes flicked over the document, her lips pressing into a thin line. There was no urgency in her movements, no indication that she was willing to resolve the issue swiftly. Instead, Brenda picked up the paper with the air of someone humoring a child, her fingers tapping it lightly as she read. Brenda said again, her tone dripping with skepticism. This looks unusual. Yvette tilted her head slightly, her calm exterior unwavering. What exactly is unusual about a confirmed reservation? Brenda set the paper down without answering directly, turning back to her computer screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, as if deciding whether it was worth the effort to type. "I'll check again," she said at last, her tone clipped. Behind Yvette, the whispers grew louder. She didn't need to turn around to know that eyes were on her. The weight of their gazes pressed against her back, and though she kept her posture straight, she felt the subtle sting of judgment. Brenda's typing was slow, deliberate, almost performative. She sighed softly as though the task was an inconvenience, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the keys. Each tap seemed to stretch the moment, the tension in the room thickening with every passing second. Finally, Brenda leaned back in her chair and let out a dramatic breath. "I'm sorry, Miss Blake," she said, her voice betraying a hint of satisfaction. "There's still no record of your reservation. Are you absolutely certain this is the correct terminal?" Yvette's jaw tightened ever so slightly. She had dealt with this kind of behavior before, the subtle condescension, the implied questions about her legitimacy. She had learned long ago not to let it rattle her, but that didn't mean she would tolerate it. "I'm certain," Yvette said, her voice calm but firm. "And I suggest you double-check your system. This reservation was made weeks ago, and I confirmed it just yesterday." Brenda raised an eyebrow, her expression hovering between doubt and disdain. "I see," she said, her tone neutral on the surface but laced with a quiet challenge. "Well, as I mentioned, we don't have any record. Perhaps you should check with your assistant. They might have made an error." The insinuation hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Yvette felt her patience stretch thin, but she refused to give Brenda the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she took a slow breath, her eyes locked on the woman in front of her. "I appreciate your suggestion," Yvette said, her words measured, "but I'd prefer if you checked again. Perhaps you missed something the first time." Brenda's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, her tone bordering on patronizing. She turned back to her screen, her fingers resuming their sluggish typing. The room seemed to grow quieter, the tension palpable. Yvette could sense the curiosity around her building, the other passengers leaning in to watch the interaction unfold. She didn't need to hear their whispers to know what they were thinking. She had seen this play out before, in boardrooms, luxury boutiques, and even high-end restaurants. The question wasn't spoken aloud, but it lingered in every glance. What is she doing here? Minutes passed, each one dragging longer than the last. Yvette stood her ground, her expression calm but resolute. She would not be dismissed. Not here, not now. Brenda finally turned back, her face a practiced mask of professionalism that didn't quite hide the flicker of irritation in her eyes. "I've checked everything," she said. "There's nothing under your name. And without a valid reservation in our system, I'm afraid I can't allow you to remain in the terminal." The words landed like a challenge, and Yvette felt the shift in the room. The murmurs grew louder, the whispers no longer masked by subtlety. "I'd like to speak with the manager," Yvette said, her voice steady. Brenda hesitated, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "The manager is busy," she said, her tone firm. "And frankly, I don't think it will change anything. If you don't have a valid reservation." "I do have a valid reservation," Yvette interrupted, her voice carrying an edge of steel, "and I'm not leaving until this is resolved." The tension between them was almost tangible now, the air charged with unspoken words. Brenda's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Yvette thought she might push back further. But instead, Brenda reached for the phone, her movements stiff. "I'll call security," Brenda said, her voice cold. Yvette didn't flinch. She stood tall, her confidence unshaken, as she watched Brenda pick up the receiver. The room seemed to hold its breath, the stares of the other passengers sharpening into something more pointed. Yvette could feel the weight of the moment, the familiar mix of frustration and determination rising within her. She wasn't here to make a scene, but she also wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. Yvette stood motionless, her eyes fixed on Brenda as the woman pressed the buttons on the desk phone with deliberate slowness. The hum of whispered conversations behind her became more audible, punctuated by the occasional sound of a stifled laugh or the unmistakable click of someone snapping a photo with their phone. She didn't turn around. She refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her ruffled. Brenda spoke into the receiver with an air of exaggerated calm. "Yes, I need security at the front desk. We have a situation." She glanced up at Yvette as she said the word, her lips curving into a faint, almost triumphant smirk. "Thank you." She placed the phone back in its cradle, her movements sharp and deliberate. Yvette's grip on her leather bag tightened. It wasn't anger, at least, not entirely. It was the frustration of seeing a scene play out exactly as she'd expected, the script all too familiar. But this time, she reminded herself, the outcome would be different. "You didn't have to call security," Yvette said evenly. Her tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it all. "All I asked was for you to do your job." Brenda's smile widened, but it wasn't friendly. "I'm simply following protocol, ma'am. If there's no reservation on file, I have no choice but to act accordingly." "Protocol," Yvette repeated, her voice sharpening. She stepped closer to the counter, her presence commanding without needing to raise her voice. "And does your protocol include ignoring valid documentation or calling security on a paying customer who hasn't raised her voice or caused a scene?" Brenda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sliding glass doors at the far end of the terminal hissed open. Two uniformed security guards entered, their heavy boots clunking against the polished floor. Both men were tall and broad-shouldered, their faces set in expressions of professional detachment. The murmurs in the room grew louder, a ripple of anticipation spreading through the lounge. Yvette felt the weight of the moment settle over her, but she refused to move. She squared her shoulders, her stance unyielding. "Is there a problem here?" one of the guards asked, his voice deep and measured as he approached the desk. His eyes flicked to Yvette briefly before settling on Brenda. "Yes," Brenda said quickly, her tone shifting to one of polite authority. "This individual is insisting she has a reservation, but there's no record of it. She's refusing to leave the terminal." The guard turned to Yvette, his expression neutral. "Ma'am, do you have any other form of identification or proof of your reservation?" Yvette reached into her bag, her movements deliberate. She pulled out a second document, a printed itinerary with her name, flight number, and the terminal's logo prominently displayed. She handed it to the guard, meeting his gaze directly. "This is my proof," she said calmly. "It's all here. The reservation was made weeks ago, and it's valid." The guard studied the document for a moment, his brow furrowing. He glanced at Brenda, who was watching him closely, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "It seems legitimate," the guard said, his voice carefully. Brenda leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "If it were legitimate, it would be in the system," she said firmly. "We have strict guidelines here. If her name isn't on the manifest, there's nothing more we can do." Yvette's patience was nearing its limit. She took a step closer to the desk, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable authority. "You keep saying there's nothing more you can do," she said. "But what you can do is stop wasting everyone's time and check your system again, thoroughly." Brenda hesitated, her eyes flicking to the security guards as though gauging their support. Finally, with a huff of irritation, she turned back to her computer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, the sound of her typing filling the tense silence. The seconds stretched into a full minute, the atmosphere in the room thick with anticipation. Yvette felt the gazes of the other passengers boring into her, a mixture of curiosity and judgment. She didn't look at them. Her focus remained on Brenda, who was now biting her lip as she stared at the screen. "Well?" one of the guards prompted, his tone neutral but expectant. Brenda straightened, her face carefully blank. "There's still nothing under her name," she said, but there was a hesitation in her voice now, a faint crack in her confidence. Yvette didn't miss it. She took another step closer, her calm composure unwavering. "Then I suggest you escalate this to someone who can resolve it," she said. Brenda bristled, but before she could respond, the sliding doors opened again. This time, it wasn't more security. It was Yvette's assistant, dressed in a sharp navy suit. Her assistant strode into the terminal with purposeful urgency. She carried a sleek black briefcase in one hand and a phone in the other, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Yvette," the assistant called, her voice carrying across the lounge. "Sorry I'm late. I have the documentation you requested." The sudden arrival caused a stir, the whispers growing louder as passengers watched the scene unfold. Yvette felt a surge of relief but didn't let it show. Instead, she turned to greet her assistant with a calm nod. "Perfect timing," Yvette said, her tone even. "Brenda here seems to be having trouble locating my reservation." The assistant reached the counter, her movements brisk and efficient. She placed the briefcase on the counter and opened it, retrieving a stack of neatly organized papers. "These," she said, handing them to Brenda, "should clear up any confusion." Brenda's face tightened, but she took the papers without a word. As she scanned them, the color drained slightly from her cheeks. Yvette could see the realization dawning in her eyes. The truth she had been so eager to dismiss was now undeniable. "Is there still an issue?" Yvette asked, her voice calm, but with an edge of finality. Brenda didn't respond immediately. She set the papers down with a forced smile, but her discomfort was evident. "It seems everything is in order," she said, her tone clipped. Yvette didn't smile. She simply looked at Brenda, letting the silence linger. This was far from over. The tension in the room was thick as Yvette stood silently, her presence commanding, even as Brenda fidgeted behind the counter. The assistant's arrival and the stack of undeniable proof had stripped away the facade of Brenda's confidence, leaving an awkward pause in its wake. Yvette could feel the weight of the moment, the whispers around her growing softer as passengers strained to hear what would happen next. Brenda cleared her throat, a sharp and brittle sound. "As I said," she began, her tone attempting to regain control but failing to mask her unease. "Everything seems to be in order. There may have been a glitch in the system." Yvette raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but unyielding. "A glitch?" she repeated, the word hanging in the air. "Is that what you're calling it?" Brenda's hands fidgeted with the edge of the papers, her manicured nails clicking against the counter. "It's not uncommon," she said, avoiding Yvette's gaze. "These things happen." Yvette stepped closer, her movements deliberate, her voice steady but sharp. "Let's be clear," she said. "This wasn't a glitch. This was you deciding, based on nothing but your assumptions, that I didn't belong here. And now you're trying to cover your tracks." Brenda's cheeks flushed, and her lips pressed into a tight line. "I assure you, that's not." "You called security on me," Yvette interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You made assumptions about who I am and why I'm here, without doing your job properly. And now that you've been proven wrong, you expect me to accept a half-hearted excuse about a glitch." The room fell silent. Even the hum of distant engines seemed to fade as everyone focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. Brenda looked around, as though searching for support, but the security guards, the assistant, and the other passengers offered none. Yvette's assistant stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We've provided every document you could possibly need," she said. "But this isn't just about a reservation, is it?" She glanced at Yvette, then back at Brenda. "It's about how you've chosen to treat her from the moment she walked in." Brenda opened her mouth to respond, but the sliding doors hissed open again, and this time, the terminal manager entered. A man in his mid-50s, his graying hair neatly combed and his tailored suit exuding authority, strode into the room with an air of urgency. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, landing on Yvette and Brenda. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. Before Brenda could speak, Yvette stepped forward. "I'm glad you're here," she said, her tone polite but firm. "There's been an issue with your staff." The manager's brows furrowed as he turned to Brenda. "What kind of issue?" Brenda hesitated, her discomfort evident. "There was a mix-up with the reservation," she said, her voice strained. "I was just explaining." "No," Yvette interrupted, her voice steady. "You weren't explaining. You were dismissing me. You refused to acknowledge my reservation. Despite having documentation, you called security on me instead of doing your job, and now you're trying to deflect blame." The manager's face darkened as he listened, his gaze shifting from Yvette to Brenda. "Is this true?" he asked Brenda, his tone sharper now. Brenda stammered, her composure unraveling. "I didn't mean." Yvette's assistant cut in, her voice cool and precise. "We have all the proof of the reservation, and we've witnessed everything that's happened here. Your employee not only failed to provide basic customer service, but also escalated the situation unnecessarily. This isn't just a mistake, it's unacceptable behavior." The manager exhaled deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose as though trying to process the severity of the situation. He turned to Yvette, his tone apologetic. "Miss Blake, I deeply regret what's happened here. This is not how we conduct business, and I assure you, I will address this matter immediately." Yvette's expression remained calm, but there was an edge of disappointment in her voice. "It shouldn't have happened in the first place," she said. "This isn't about an apology. This is about accountability." The manager nodded, his demeanor serious. "You're absolutely right. Brenda, I need to speak with you in my office." Now, Brenda's face paled, and she opened her mouth to protest, but the manager's expression left no room for argument. She turned and walked toward the office, her steps hurried and unsteady. Yvette turned to the manager. "I hope you'll take more than disciplinary action," she said. "This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to experience what I just did." The manager nodded again, his tone resolute. "I'll make sure of it, Miss Blake. You have my word." As the manager walked away, Yvette let out a slow breath. The confrontation was over, but the weight of what had transpired still lingered. She glanced at her assistant, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Are you okay?" the assistant asked softly. Yvette managed a small smile. "I'm fine," she said. "But this isn't over yet." She turned and walked toward the lounge, her head held high. The whispers around her had faded into silence, replaced by the quiet respect of those who had witnessed her stand her ground. Yvette seated herself in the lounge area near the panoramic windows, her back straight and her demeanor composed. The tension of the earlier confrontation still hung in the air, and she could feel the residual gazes of curious onlookers. She took a deep breath, centering herself. The fight wasn't over, but she would handle it on her terms. Her assistant, seated beside her, began typing furiously on her laptop, no doubt preparing a detailed report of the incident. Yvette glanced over at her. "Make sure to include every detail," she said softly, "and send it to the board once we're airborne." "Yes, ma'am," her assistant replied, her voice low but resolute. Yvette reached into her bag, retrieving her phone. With a few swipes, she navigated to her contacts and dialed a familiar number. It rang twice before a calm, authoritative voice answered. "Yvette," the voice said warmly, "how's the trip so far?" Yvette leaned back slightly, her tone steady but tinged with frustration. "Not as smooth as it should be, Jordan. I've just had an experience at the terminal that you'll want to hear about." Jordan, the CEO of the aviation company that owned the terminal, fell silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone was serious. "What happened?" Yvette recounted the events in detail, her voice unwavering as she described the treatment she had endured. She left nothing out. The dismissive remarks, the unnecessary call to security, and the clear bias that had fueled the entire situation. By the time she finished, Jordan's voice was tight with controlled anger. "This is unacceptable," he said. "Brenda is one of the terminal's senior attendants. She should have known better." "She didn't," Yvette replied, "and that's a problem. This isn't just about me, Jordan. If she felt comfortable treating me this way, imagine how she's treating others who don't have the same resources or connections to push back." "You're absolutely right," Jordan said. "I'll handle this personally. Are you still at the terminal?" "I am," Yvette said, glancing at her assistant, who nodded in understanding. "But I won't be leaving quietly. This needs to be addressed now, not later." Jordan didn't hesitate. "Give me 20 minutes. I'll be there." Yvette ended the call and placed her phone on the table in front of her. The energy in the lounge had shifted. While the other passengers pretended to focus on their own affairs, Yvette could feel their anticipation. They were waiting to see what would happen next, their curiosity barely hidden behind magazines and phone screens. True to his word, 20 minutes later, the sliding glass doors opened again. This time, it wasn't just a manager or security. It was Jordan himself, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit. His presence was magnetic. His expression was a mixture of calm professionalism and barely restrained anger. He strode into the lounge with purpose, flanked by two senior executives from the aviation company. The murmur of voices in the room fell silent as they made their way directly to Yvette. "Yvette," Jordan said, extending his hand. "Thank you for your patience. I'm here to make this right." Yvette stood, shaking his hand firmly. "Jordan," she said, "it's good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Jordan nodded, then turned to the manager, who had appeared behind him, clearly uneasy. "Where is Brenda?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's in the office," the manager stammered. "I can bring her out." "Do that," Jordan said curtly. Moments later, Brenda emerged, her face pale and her posture defensive. She glanced at Jordan, then at Yvette, and for a fleeting moment, her expression betrayed a flicker of panic. "Brenda," Jordan began, his voice even but firm. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Brenda opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her gaze darted to Yvette, then back to Jordan. "This is Yvette Blake," Jordan continued. "She's not just a passenger. She's a major stakeholder in this company. The very company that pays your salary." The color drained from Brenda's face entirely. "I didn't know," she stammered. "You didn't bother to find out," Yvette interjected, her voice calm but cutting. "You dismissed me based on your assumptions, and you escalated a situation that never needed to exist." Jordan nodded, his expression hardening. "Brenda, your behavior today has not only embarrassed this company, but has also gone against every standard of professionalism and respect we uphold. Effective immediately, you're terminated from your position." Brenda's eyes widened, and she took a step forward, her voice trembling. "But please, I didn't mean." "This isn't about what you meant," Jordan said sharply. "It's about what you did, and your actions have consequences." The room was silent, the tension almost tangible, as Brenda stood frozen, the weight of her dismissal sinking in. Jordan turned back to Yvette. "Yvette, I want to personally apologize on behalf of the entire company. This incident does not reflect our values, and I assure you, steps will be taken to ensure it never happens again." Yvette nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I appreciate that, Jordan, but I'll be following up to make sure those steps are taken." "Of course," Jordan said. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As Brenda was escorted out of the terminal, the other passengers looked on in stunned silence. Yvette turned to Jordan one last time. "Let this be a lesson," she said, "not just for her, but for everyone. Change doesn't happen without accountability." Jordan nodded solemnly. "It will, Yvette. You have my word." Yvette returned to her seat, her composure unshaken. She had faced the storm and emerged stronger, knowing that her actions had set the stage for a better future not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved respect and equality. Yvette sat back in her chair, her gaze steady on the now empty reception desk. The hum of whispers in the lounge had faded into a reverent silence. The passengers who had been onlookers were no longer speaking among themselves, but instead, stealing glances at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She could feel the weight of their thoughts, some silently commending her, others unsure how to process the turn of events. Her assistant leaned in slightly, breaking the stillness. "The incident report is ready," she said quietly, tapping her laptop. "I've included everything, the timestamps, Brenda's remarks, and the escalation to security." "Good," Yvette replied, her voice low but firm. "Send it to the board, Jordan, and the compliance team. This isn't just about her termination. It's about setting a precedent." Her assistant nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Yvette's eyes drifted toward the glass wall where a private jet was taxiing onto the runway. The sleek aircraft glinted under the midday sun, a reminder of the world she had worked tirelessly to enter. But moments like this reminded her that being part of it wasn't enough. She had to fight to reshape it. Jordan approached her again, his pace slower now, his demeanor slightly less formal. He stopped a few steps away, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Yvette glanced up, her expression calm but guarded. "Yvette," he began, his voice quieter than before. "I want you to know that this incident is being addressed at every level. Brenda's behavior wasn't just an individual failure. It's a symptom of a broader problem, one we need to root out." Yvette studied him for a moment, her silence intentional. She wanted him to understand the weight of her expectations before she spoke. "It's not enough to fire her, Jordan," she said finally. "There need to be systemic changes, policies, training, accountability, all of it." He nodded, his expression resolute. "I agree. We've been working on updating our diversity and inclusion protocols, but clearly we've fallen short. I'd like your input on how we can do better." Yvette raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Are you asking me to consult?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "Your insight would be invaluable. We need someone who understands these issues from both a personal and professional perspective." She leaned back slightly, considering his words. "I'll think about it," she said. "But for now, my focus is on ensuring that what happened today is never repeated." "Understood," he replied. "And thank you for handling this with such grace." Yvette offered a faint smile, though her thoughts were still racing. She watched as Jordan stepped away, his posture stiff with the weight of what had just transpired. The executives flanking him followed, murmuring among themselves as they exited the lounge. Her assistant closed the laptop with a soft click. "What's next?" she asked, her tone steady. Yvette exhaled slowly. "We board the plane," she said. "And once we're airborne, we make sure the board understands the urgency of what happened here." Before her assistant could respond, one of the other passengers, a woman in her late 40s dressed in a chic business suit, approached hesitantly. Her steps were small, almost reluctant, and her hands clasped a leather portfolio tightly against her chest. "Excuse me," the woman said softly, her voice laced with hesitation. "I just wanted to say that was extraordinary, the way you handled everything. It was inspiring." Yvette turned her head slightly, meeting the woman's gaze. There was sincerity in her eyes, a kind of quiet admiration that Yvette had seen before, but never quite gotten used to. "Thank you," Yvette replied simply. The woman lingered for a moment before speaking again. "I've seen situations like this before, but I've never had the courage to speak up. Watching you, it reminded me that we have to hold people accountable. So, thank you for that." Yvette nodded, her expression softening. "We all have a role to play," she said. "It's not easy, but it's necessary." The woman gave a small smile, then stepped back, returning to her seat. Yvette watched her for a moment before turning her attention back to the runway. The jet she had been watching earlier was now taking off, its engines roaring as it climbed into the sky. The sound reminded her of her own departure, imminent now that the conflict had been resolved. But as she sat there, Yvette knew that this moment wasn't the end. It was just another chapter in a much larger fight for change. The sliding doors hissed open again, and a uniformed attendant approached with a warm smile. "Miss Blake," she said, her tone polite and professional. "Your jet is ready for boarding whenever you are." Yvette stood, smoothing the front of her blazer. "Thank you," she said. She turned to her assistant. "Let's go." The cabin of the private jet was a haven of comfort and elegance, its leather seats and soft lighting creating an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. Yvette settled into her seat by the window, her assistant taking the one across from her. The faint hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the terminal just moments before. As the flight attendant approached with a tray of refreshments, Yvette gave a polite nod but declined. Her mind was too focused, her thoughts racing with the events of the day and what they meant for the future. Her assistant handed her a tablet, the screen already displaying the report that had been sent to the board. Yvette scanned the document, her sharp eyes catching every detail. The timeline of the incident, Brenda's exact words, the role of the security guards, everything was there, meticulously documented. "Good work," Yvette said softly, her tone carrying a quiet authority. She handed the tablet back, her gaze drifting to the window, where clouds drifted lazily against a pale blue sky. "Now, we wait for their response." The assistant nodded, but her expression was thoughtful. "Do you think they'll take it seriously?" she asked hesitantly. "They seem genuine, but they'll have no choice," Yvette replied, her voice firm. "This isn't just about one person's actions. It's about a culture that allowed it to happen. If they want to avoid this becoming a larger issue, they'll act, and they'll act quickly." As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Yvette leaned back in her seat, her mind returning to the confrontation in the terminal. Brenda's dismissal had been swift and justified, but it wasn't enough. Yvette knew that change required more than removing one person. It required a complete overhaul of the system that had enabled her behavior in the first place. Her assistant cleared her throat, pulling Yvette from her thoughts. "There's an incoming video call," she said, holding up the tablet. "It's Jordan and the board." Yvette nodded, straightening in her seat. "Put it through." The screen lit up with the faces of several board members, their expressions a mixture of concern and attentiveness. Jordan's face was front and center, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a look of resolute determination. "Yvette," Jordan began, his tone formal but earnest, "we've reviewed the report you sent, and I want to start by thanking you for bringing this to our attention. It's clear that what happened today was completely unacceptable." Yvette's expression remained neutral, her gaze unwavering. "I appreciate your acknowledgement," she said, "but acknowledgement isn't enough. What's your plan to address this?" One of the board members, an older woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward. "We've already terminated the employee involved, as you know," she said. "But we agree that this incident highlights deeper issues within our organization." Jordan nodded in agreement. "That's why we're proposing an immediate review of our policies and training programs. We need to ensure that every employee, from top to bottom, understands that discrimination and bias have no place here." Yvette listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "That's a start," she said, "but training alone won't fix the problem. You need accountability, regular audits, clear reporting channels, and consequences for anyone who fails to meet these standards." "We've discussed that as well," Jordan said, "and we'd like your input on how to implement these changes effectively." Yvette raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me to lead this initiative?" Jordan's gaze didn't waver. "Yes," he said simply. "Your experience and perspective make you uniquely qualified. If you're willing, we'd like you to take on a consulting role to help us reshape our culture." There was a pause as Yvette considered his words. She wasn't surprised by the offer, but the weight of what it represented wasn't lost on her. This was an opportunity to effect real change, to ensure that what had happened to her would never happen to anyone else. "I'll do it," she said finally, "but on one condition. I have full authority to make the changes I see fit. No red tape, no delays." Jordan nodded, his expression one of relief. "Agreed," he said. "Thank you, Yvette. This company will be better for it." The call ended, and Yvette set the tablet aside, her mind already racing with ideas. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But as she looked out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her assistant broke the silence. "That was bold," she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. Yvette smiled faintly. "Bold is the only way to get things done," she said. "Now, let's make sure we follow through." The private jet touched down smoothly, its wheels kissing the runway with a gentle thud. Yvette gazed out the window, watching the sprawling cityscape come into view. The skyline gleamed in the afternoon sun, a mix of towering skyscrapers and vibrant greenery that symbolized progress and resilience. It mirrored how she felt, strong, focused, and ready for what lay ahead. Her assistant gathered their belongings efficiently, but Yvette took her time. She wanted to savor this moment, to reflect on the whirlwind of events that had unfolded over the past few hours. The sting of the earlier humiliation had faded, replaced by a sense of triumph not just personal, but meaningful on a larger scale. As they disembarked, a car was already waiting on the tarmac. The driver opened the door with a polite nod, and Yvette slid into the back seat, the cool leather seats a welcome respite. Her assistant joined her, setting down the tablet and a neatly packed folder. "What's next?" the assistant asked, her tone a mix of exhaustion and excitement. Yvette leaned back, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest. "The next step is ensuring that the promises made today are kept," she said firmly. "We're not just changing a policy, we're changing a culture. That takes persistence." The assistant nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think they'll follow through?" Jordan seemed genuine, but these things often lose momentum. "They'll follow through," Yvette said with quiet conviction, "because we'll make sure they do. This isn't just about fixing what went wrong today. It's about setting a standard for the future." The car pulled away from the airport, the city buzzing with life around them. Yvette watched as people moved about, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles. She thought of the woman in the lounge who had approached her, the passengers who had silently witnessed her stand her ground. Her actions today weren't just for her. They were for all the people who might face similar challenges but feel powerless to fight back. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. It was a notification, an email from the board. Yvette opened it, scanning the content quickly. It was a formal statement acknowledging her new role as a consultant to lead the company's cultural transformation. The email ended with a note from Jordan, Your courage today reminded us all of the responsibility we have to do better. Thank you for holding us accountable. Together, we'll make this right." Yvette's lips curved into a faint smile. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. The car turned into the driveway of a modern office building the headquarters of her foundation. Her assistant gathered her things, preparing for their next meeting, but Yvette lingered for a moment. As she stepped out of the car, a sense of purpose filled her. Today's battle was over, but the fight for justice was ongoing. Yvette knew that true change was a marathon, not a sprint. She walked into the building with her head held high, ready to face whatever came next. For her, the journey wasn't just about overcoming challenges. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't have to. And as she entered the boardroom, greeted by her team with nods of respect and admiration, Yvette knew one thing for certain. The path to justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. Yvette's actions that day didn't just resolve her own struggle. They sparked a ripple effect of accountability and change, setting a new standard for justice and fairness. Her story is a powerful reminder that standing up against injustice can create a better future for everyone. If this story resonated with you, if it inspired you to believe in the power of resilience and courage, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join us for more stories that matter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.